All right, welcome back to the DNR Sports Football webcast. This is the first time I think in probably 3 or 4 years that we've had this. It's been a long time, pre-COVID for sure, and John and I are bringing it back. Try to talk a little bit about some high school football. This will be uploaded to the Rocktown podcast as well, which will be returning, and we'll talk about volleyball and cross country and some other sports on there as well. But for today, we're going to talk about football. And recap a little bit of week one, and then also go over some of the big matchups coming up on the slate this week. So looking back at last week, we had an exciting first week. I mean, John had one of the bigger games in the area with Turner Ashby and Fort Defiance taking on each other, and for a lot of that game, it seemed like it was going to be a close affair with both teams kind of battling back and forth. And then that second half, I thought TA really kind of showcased what we see out of them long term in terms of their potential with that explosive offense, a defense that can shut you down. They really pulled away there. Obviously, pull away for a 51-22 win. I mean, John, what were your biggest takeaways, I guess, from that game?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed it up perfectly. I mean, certainly, early in the game, it really looked like Fort Defiance. They were going back and forth, and it was very much a close match early on, but as it got towards the end of the second quarter, one of the big pivotal plays in that game was Turner Ashby fumbled for the second consecutive drive, turnover to Fort Defiance. The first time they fumbled, it led to a Fort Defiance touchdown on their next drive. But this time around, the very first play, Fort Defiance throws an interception and TA takes it back 66 yards. That really seemed to take the wind out of Fort Defiance's sails for sure. And from there, I mean, as you mentioned, the second half, it was all Turner Ashby. I thought Micah Shank looked phenomenal, both on the feet and in passing. I mean, he had some rushes for pretty big gains. Bo Baylor looked great. Gage Kelly looked great. Micah Matthews looked great. I mean, I think if you're TA head coach Scott Turner, I think you got to be feeling pretty good. Aside from some flub ups there in the second quarter, but I think he's got to be feeling pretty good about where they're at right now.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too. Throughout the whole preseason, he's talked a lot about their defense and how that's going to be their strong point, their staple. But when you talk about TA, just like you mentioned, you talk about guys like Bo Baylor, Micah Shank, Micah Matthews, Gage Kelly, Calvin Young. They have so many skill guys that are so big and so key and have the potential to do special things. But Scott Turner has made a point to make sure that people know that their defense is what's going to carry them this year, and if they're going to have a special season, that's going to be a big reason why. And it sounds like in the post-game interview with you, that was the first thing he mentioned was that defense and how that really kind of held them into the game for a while and allowed their offense to get in a rhythm. And then that second half, it seemed like that was when the offense woke up and kind of pulled them away there.
For sure. And in fact, when I talked to Fort Defiance head coach Dan Rolfe, they knew that was going to be one of the biggest challenges. Is just, TA has so many weapons in their arsenal. And, they knew that was going to be tough. And, I think for Fort Defiance, too, I think, obviously the score 51-22 doesn't, look good. And obviously the second half, they I think have some things to clean up moving forward. But I think you got to look at that first half, though, and the way they came out and really took on TA early on. I think that's something they got to be happy with moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people got to remember that Fort team is still, relatively young. They're experienced, but they are young, but they're also moving down to Class 2 this year. So, when you look at that Class 2 level, you're talking about Central, Store Strath, some of those top teams at the top. But, this is not a team that no longer has to go through Spotswood and Turner Ashby and Broadway and these teams in Region 3C. So that'll certainly help Fort in the long run as the season moves along. Some other results from last week, just going throughout the area. Washington, West Virginia, runs past Page 49-6. King William and Store Strath 7-6. That was a close one. That was a good game with a really good team out of Richmond. The big one down in Woodstock was Central defeating Riverheads 8-7 on a late touchdown and a two-point conversion. Obviously Riverheads, the Class 1 power, the last 7 state championships, and I know a lot of people will try to turn this game into something more than what it was, but really just two good teams, two really defensive-oriented teams, and a really nice win for Central. I think, if anything, it tells you more about Central this year than it does Riverheads with how good of a team that could be. Other scores, Wilson Memorial, in their first game under head coach Ryan Bird, runs past Charlottesville 55-8, 41 first quarter points in that one. That one was pretty wild to watch take place on social media. Other games, Madison County 15, Stanton 14. James River beat Buffalo Gap 13-12, so several one-point losses there for some Augusta County teams. Allegheny Highlands defeats Waynesboro 35-7. And then another close one here for one of our city-county teams. Broadway falls 28-27 in overtime to Fluvanna County. And, that was another thrilling game. It seemed like I think Broadway's going to be an interesting team. I mean, they've got, so many new pieces out there. Uriah Rudin at quarterback. They've got, Stuhlmiller as another key weapon there. Ryder Post, obviously the VMI commit or VMI recruit. Just so many names there around that offense, and so many guys with a lot of potential. But they are young and they're very inexperienced. So it's going to be interesting to kind of see how they bounce back, because things don't get any easier from here for Broadway. Other scores just to wrap up last week. Millbrook obviously beats Harrisburg 40-0. I know you were at that one.
Yep.
And then Rustburg, Spotswood was winning for most of the game, but Rustburg comes back late and beats Spotswood 28-24. So obviously a tough pill to swallow there for Spotswood. So looking ahead just to this week now, we'll start again with TA. I think they've got another good one against another good Augusta County team. We mentioned Wilson got off to a hot start last week. Breeden Tyree is the big running back for them. He had the kickoff return for touchdowns, ended up with several others throughout the night. They're being coached by Ryan Bird, who is a former Ford assistant, played at Emory and Henry. Really well-liked guy. It seems like the kids are really attached to playing for him. But they'll certainly have a bigger test this week with TA. Just going over some of the numbers, Micah Shank, you mentioned, had 299 all-purpose yards last week, 4 touchdowns through the air. Micah Matthews finished with 102 yards and a touchdown. Calvin Young with 2 touchdowns off just 3 catches. Joey Amlaker, 3 catches, 77 yards and a touchdown. And then Bo Baylor, 56 yards. This is, arguably the best team in the Valley District facing a team that is hopeful to compete in the Shenandoah District for a title. I think this has potential to be a good one. I would say TA probably has a little bit of the edge, but this is a game I think Wilson has a chance to, maybe kind of as a measuring stick a little bit and kind of make a statement a little bit.
For sure, and I think, when you really look at the Valley District, I mean, you can certainly say Turner Ashby, after the performance last week, is certainly, the top contender right now to win the Valley District. I'm really interested to see how East Rockingham fares as we go on late in the season. Obviously, they, you mentioned they beat Luray 28-14, pretty stout performance. I know head coach Drew Spitzer, I remember in the offseason talking about, he's really excited about that offensive line and feels they're really going to be a force to be reckoned with this season. So it'll be interesting to see how everything shakes out. But yeah, I think Turner Ashby and Wilson Memorial, that's going to be really interesting matchup coming up this week.
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing with Turner Ashby, what you want to see if you're a Turner Ashby fan or a coach is you want to see them come out against strong. Where last week they came out, and as you mentioned, they had a lackadaisical second quarter. I think, against Wilson Memorial, ideally you want to see them come out a little more sharp. You want to see them take care of business. Against a quality opponent that they're going to have their hands full with. You want to see them, leave no doubt. I think good teams, typically that's what you do. Special teams that can make special runs, that's what you do. And I think if you're head coach Scott Turner, you want to see your team kind of do that this week. You don't want to see them have a quarter or two where they kind of let a team hang around. You want to see them come out and play at their peak from the start. So that's something I'm interested to see with TA. And I think for Wilson, after last week, you're obviously riding high. You're obviously feeling good. Like I said, this will be a much stiffer test, and I think Wilson has a very good team with a lot of options. Obviously, Ronan Taylor's at quarterback now. He was a good runner a year ago. Ryan Mundy is a really good player both ways, as a bruising running back and then as a linebacker. And then, as I mentioned, Breeden Tyree, he's obviously a special guy with a lot of skills. So this will be an interesting matchup, and I think for both teams, there's going to be a lot to take away from this one. I think for Wilson, if you can even keep it close, but especially if you can pull off a win here, you're looking really good to compete for that Shenandoah District title. Where TA, you just want to keep that momentum going and kind of handle business against a team that you would think that you should. And as you mentioned, East Rock, they've got another good one this week. Playing some of those former Bull Run District rivals, and this week they head up to Woodstock. They get to make the trip this time and play a Central team that's coming off, like I mentioned, the big win over Riverheads. That win last week against Luray I thought was impressive. You mentioned their offensive line is really good. They've got a ton of skill guys. They've got Xavier Brown, Damian Durrett, Blake Moore, several other guys that they get the ball to. That is a team, too, that I'm also curious to watch as the season goes along, that can kind of put themselves in that discussion with TA and Spotswood at the top. Last week, Parker Seaver, the freshman, gets the start at quarterback, finishes 6 of 13, but goes for 125 yards, 2 touchdowns and an interception. And as I mentioned, he's got a ton of tools to throw to, and it turned out that Xavier Brown was his favorite one. He finished with 3 catches, 120 yards, and 2 scores. So fresh off a win, 28-14 over Luray. I mean, this is an opportunity for East Rock to make a huge statement if they can go to Woodstock and beat Central, who, a lot of people consider either the best team or one of the best teams in the entire area right now.
For sure, and I'm also interested to see how Luray sort of tries to bounce back against Buffalo Gap. I feel like Luray, they're a very formidable team. They've got a very strong running game, so it'll be interesting to see if they can bounce back on the road against Buffalo Gap. And I actually wanted to go back. You mentioned Millbrook, Harrisonburg. Obviously, Harrisonburg, coming off a winless season last year, not how they wanted to start the season out. So, Coach Kyle Gillenwater said, they have a lot of things to clean up. It's a matter of execution, and so we'll see if they can bounce back at John Hanley this Saturday.
Yeah, I hate to move around here, but to touch on Harrisonburg too, you're right. I mean, that's a team, they've got such a difficult non-district schedule, and John Hanley, Millbrook, these are teams that are really, really good. These aren't winless teams or 2-win teams that they're falling to. For a program that's trying to get back on its feet, you got to feel for them a little bit, because their schedule certainly doesn't do them any favors.
For sure.
Because they've got some talented kids, like you mentioned, J.J. Engel, V.J. Bullard, Aaron McAfee. They've got some guys on that team that can make things happen. But their schedule is really difficult, and it's not going to get any easier. You just hope at some point they can get a win and just get some confidence back in that program and get things on track. As far as East Rock and Central, I think this is certainly a winnable game for East Rock. I think that if they can put everything together, if they can play a sound game defensively, stop that Central run game, and kind of get the ball in the hands of their playmakers, I think they've got a chance. But as you said, Central is extremely physical. Central's filled with veterans. Nathan Lopez, who was our Defensive Player of the Year last year. Tyler Forbes is an all-state linebacker and a great running back. There's a lot of talent on that Central team. I don't think anybody's arguing that. But this is a big game for East Rock, and a big opportunity here to make a statement early against a team that they faced often throughout the years in the Bull Red District, but now they're non-district opponents, and this is a chance maybe to kind of get some momentum early in the season. You mentioned Luray trying to bounce back from that same loss to East Rock. They're facing a Gap team that's also 0-1, so two teams here searching for their first win. Gap's won 4 of the last 5 against Luray. But both offenses struggled last week. Obviously, Buffalo Gap scored 12 points, Luray scored 14. I think what's going to be interesting is how the Bulldogs kind of respond. I think that they're going to be better than what last week indicated. They've got Kason Bryant, who's the sophomore running back. He was great last year as a freshman. He's kind of taken on that lead back role. Last week he finished with 11 carries, 66 yards. I expect more out of him. Where Buffalo Gap is really more in a rebuild this year, I believe. They lost a lot from last year's team, a really good team last year, but they lost a lot. So I think this is a good opportunity for Luray to bounce back. But for either team, Luray or Gap, I think it's really, this is a game where you want to get a win and kind of get some momentum and some belief back after a tough opening week. 2 tough losses, 2 close losses. This is an opportunity for both teams to kind of gain some early momentum.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. I think perhaps a win is all you need. You sort of touched on Harrisonburg, and perhaps for Luray, Buffalo Gap, if they can get a win this week, that's certainly perhaps maybe the shot in the arm they need to start building some momentum early in the season.
And to touch on another team that probably really wants a win, especially after letting one slip away, Spotswood, obviously. Rustburg's a really good team from the Seminole District, a team that they could possibly see again down the road in the playoffs. That was a big time opening week matchup, and Spotswood went down there, and for 3 quarters almost, it seemed like Spotswood was the better team. Spotswood was taking care of business, was appearing to make a statement a little bit, and then obviously let the lead slip away late, fall 28-24. Just a heartbreaker for them. But I thought there was a lot of good takeaways from that game. In the passing game last year, we saw Elliott Brown really step up. He kind of emerged as their quarterback, and he looked that part again last week. 13-21 passing for 127 yards, 2 touchdowns. And then I thought in the running game, that was kind of the question mark coming into this year after losing James Stowe, who would be the running back for them. Parker Constable stepped up, 22 carries, 162 yards, and a touchdown. Just a big time game for him. That's going to be interesting to see, because I've heard a lot of good things about Parker Constable. He was a good defensive back last year, and it seems like now he's ready to kind of turn into a 2-way player for them. I think he's got a chance to have a really special season for them, and I think this week, they're playing a Western Albemarle team that's coming off a 42-3 loss to Cave Spring. This isn't necessarily your Western Albemarle teams that we've seen in the past that have been perennial powers and have been really difficult opponents. I think this is a winnable game for Spotswood, and a game to for them to showcase that they're a legit contender in that Valley District as well. I mean, they've got a ton of experience, and they're a team that I think, kind of got overlooked after week one, but there's still a long season to go, and I think that, this week will give them an opportunity to remind people how good they are.
Yeah, and Elliott Brown has certainly emerged as one of the elite quarterbacks in the area. As I think you already mentioned, 13 of 21 passing last week, and after that loss, if you're head coach Dale Shiflett, I'm sure throughout that game they were executing. They were they had full control of the game, and just a matter of a few plays sort of got away from them in the end. So I feel like you mentioned Western Albemarle coming off a 42-3 loss. I imagine. If you're head coach Dale Shiflett, they got to be pretty confident heading to Western Albemarle that they can come away with a win.
Absolutely. Some other games this week. Fort Defiance heading south to take on Allegheny Highlands. Stanton is also heading south to take on Rockbridge County. Page County heads to Bath County, while Monticello travels to Waynesboro. Their first ever meeting at Waynesboro. That's a unique fact I just found out yesterday. Storch Draft is making the long trip to Surrey County this week. Manassas Park plays at William Monroe. King William will play another Shenandoah Valley team at Clark County. Mountain View goes to Nelson County. And then a couple of West Virginia games, East Hardy at Pendleton County and Moorfield at Pocahontas County. There is a Thursday night game this week with Broadway traveling to Strasburg to take on the Rams. These two teams have played the last couple of years, and Broadway has typically actually played them pretty well. But Strasburg is a team with deep postseason aspirations. They've got a pretty good squad. So Broadway's going to have their hands full once again, and I think if you're Danny Grogg going up against this experienced and talented Strasburg team, I think you just want to see growth and you just want to see your guys fight. Not to say they don't have a chance to win, but this is a tough and difficult non-district schedule for Broadway and for a young team. I think they'll learn a lot about themselves over the coming weeks, and I think even if non-district play doesn't go as well as they hoped, I think it could ultimately pay off down the line once they get into Valley District play against teams like Harrisonburg and East Rock and other teams that are around this area, where they might have a little bit better chance. But it's going to be interesting because I think Broadway has traditionally played Strasburg well, and if they can go down there and somehow pull off an upset, that suddenly turns their season around. It's only week 2, but it suddenly gives them a whole different outlook on what's possible this year.
Yeah, and you mentioned Danny Grogg, and when I talked to him during preseason, he didn't coach baseball this past spring and was able to be with the football team a little bit more, and they really feel like they're sort of one step ahead when it came to the preseason. And Strasburg is arguably one of the best teams in the area, so as you mentioned, they're going to have their hands full. But even if they don't come away with the win, if they go down to Strasburg and really give them a fight, and maybe they're within one touchdown, if it's a tight score, I think even in a loss, I think they got to be feeling pretty good about where they're at in the season and the progression they've made.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's one thing that Danny Grogg's teams have managed to do, even in their down years when they've had to be rebuilt a little bit. They've always seemed to play teams close, and I think that's something that is a testament to their character and the type of coaching staff they have there, and just the culture they've built. That's something that wasn't always the case in previous seasons before Grogg arrived. So other games, there are a couple of Saturday games. Harrisburg, as you mentioned, plays John Hanley in that classic rivalry game, and then Riverheads makes the trip to face Tazewell way down in Southwest Virginia. So a couple of good ones there. That's a quick look at week 2. We'll have all the coverage across the entire Shenandoah Valley, across Augusta County, Rockingham County, Harrisonburg, up into Page and Shenandoah. We'll have it all throughout the week and over the weekend at dnronline.com, and then again in Monday's papers. So we'll get ready for week 2, and we'll see you guys next week.